Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagoshnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, are you tired of moving and never want to move again?
Yes, I am going to live in this house forever. Good Lord, how do humans acquire so much stuff?
Like, I will never move. You will find my bones here. I'm out. I had a very similar feeling about a year and some change ago. I was like, nope, you will have to pry me out of here with like the jaws of life. Like, this place is burning down. I'm probably still going to be in here.
Yeah, I found out that I have many paper-bound books in my collection, and also that I have not read a good chunk of them, which makes me feel like a fraud. Like, I've got this bookcase displaying all my books, and we went through them one by one because that's how you pack books. And I'm like, oh, I got to read that. Oh, I got to read that. Oh, I feel weird displaying all these books I haven't read yet.
I had a similar situation with a couple of football books I had picked up, including the book Smart Football by, I believe, Chris, and the last name is escaping me.
Yeah, Chris Brown.
Yeah, Chris Brown.
But not that Chris Brown.
Exactly. So I ended up picking that up, and I never ended up reading it. I ended up picking it up, but I have all these pictures of my son, Dylan, picking up the book as like a toddler and like reading it and like looking like he's reading it. So I take all these pictures because, oh, look, the baby is reading. The baby is, the baby's trying to figure out football. Isn't that cute? He has read more of that book than I have. And when we moved the last time and I found it, I remembered that, like, oh yeah, I should totally read. It's still collecting dust, but it's a great book from what I've heard.
Yeah, I actually have read that. I strongly recommend it.
I strongly recommend doing more than letting the baby read it. Okay, I will. I will do my best. Maybe he can kind of explain a couple of the terms for me. Welcome to this episode of Norse Code. The Vikings defeated the Cowboys in a bit of a nail-biter that looked, for all intents and purposes, like it was going to end exactly the same way as Kansas City. It did not, thankfully. So we will be talking about that for the majority of this episode. But before we do, just want to thank you guys so much for listening, for following us on social media, for retweeting out links to the show. Really do appreciate it. Apologies for the kind of shorter version of the episode that we posted on Saturday morning / Friday night. We wanted to put something out for you guys as a preview. It is a good episode if you wanted to skip to the mailbag because you've already, heard the rest of the information as far as the game is concerned. You certainly can. It's only 2 questions in the mailbag, but this is this is what we're trying to do. So we didn't want to miss an episode quite yet. The bye week
we're banking it.
Yeah, we're banking this one because the bye week is coming, and there's only so much you can talk about during the bye week. So, which this year is going to fall on right around the Thanksgiving week. So, kudos. You'll have to hear all about how much Arif hates turkey when we do the live show on November 29th, when we do the special taping of the live show of Norse Code. November 29th at Pedosky's in Seattle. I will be giving out more information about that shortly, but we did announce last episode that we will be giving away a ticket to the game that night. So if you are kind of on the fence about whether or not you want to show up to the recording, come on out. We are giving away a free ticket to Pedosky's. We will talk more about that at the actual event itself. But if you are able to go to the game on Monday night, head over to Pedosky's in Seattle on November 29th. We do have a new Patreon person to mention here, a new donor by the name of Tony Kilbo. Again, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Tony. If you donate to the show in $3.50 or more per month via Patreon, you do qualify for swag from Norse Code, whether this is going to be actually, I already do know who ended up getting the Christian Ponder Lego. So that is no longer in our possession.
It's off the table.
Thank God. He in his message to me confirming the address, he said that he hopes he gets it because he's got a photo shoot planned for it. So we're going to get something back on this investment, by God. or the random things that we've picked up over the last little while, including stuff from the New York show. But you guys get free swag from Norse Code. So we'll actually be doing that for the rest of the month, though anybody who's getting anybody who becomes a donor now is going to end up having to wait till after we do the show in Seattle, because quite frankly, we are out of swag until Seattle. So I will acquire some more from Podolsky's and everything when we are out there. So, but if you are interested in donating to the show, if you hear value in what we produce every week, you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and you can donate to the show there. That is much more of a subscription based. Or you can go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well, and that's more of a one-time donation device. So all that aside, we can get to the game, the win over the Cowboys, and I want to do something a little bit different because I feel like the defense was the bigger story here, and the passing game really was exploited throughout the win. Specifically, the number of circus catches that kept falling the Cowboys' way was really astonishing. But there were two wide receivers with over 100 yards, and Mike Hughes was targeted early and often. But we were able to stop Ezekiel Elliott without Linval Joseph. So the question I have out of all of this is, how the hell did we stop Zeke without Linval? And was this one of those situations where we just wanted to make sure that we stopped Zeke and just let them pass on us, ad nauseum?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm kind of astonished too that they were able to kind of hold Zeke to that. Was it 47 yards, 2 whatever yards per attempt? Not a really great game for him, which is obviously, you put it in contrast with what the Vikings did with Dalvin Cook, who ended up having another 150 plus yards from scrimmage. And yeah, it's interesting because they got a lot of help from their defensive ends. Everson Griffin and Danielle Hunter both did a really great job against the run. And I believe Griffin had like 4 stops or something like that. I think one of them is a sack, but the other 3 stops, I think, were all in the run game. So that's pretty significant. Danielle Hunter didn't end up getting any of those stops. He ended up getting 2 tackles, but he was able to kind of funnel runs to the inside. And I think importantly, we saw a really great game from Anthony Barr, which, in how great Eric Kendricks has been this year, we've kind of been able to overlook how good Anthony Barr has been. So last year, early in the season, Barr struggled, mostly, I think, not his fault because of, we've talked about this a million times, but the Rams game. And then after that, Barr ends up having a season that he ends up getting voted to the Pro Bowl, and I wouldn't have called him a Pro Bowl quality player, but he was having a really good year. And a lot of people were kind of just willing to kind of pounce on him and say that he was having a really poor year. And I would say, he wasn't playing up to the level of 2014 or especially 2015, but he was playing really, really well. And this year he's playing significantly better. And this is kind of one of those games where we got to see him, splash early, but mostly we got to see him play just really astoundingly good run defense. And then also the Cowboys, they like to be in heavy. So, they put extra tight ends on the field. They put another running back on the field. And because of that, the Vikings actually were in base for about 15 or so snaps. And because of that, we saw Ben Gideon on the field, and they were mostly running plays. There wasn't a ton of play action. In fact, the Cowboys overall have been using less and less play action over the year, which is really astounding, kind of given their setup and actually how good they are in play action and stuff like that. And so Ben Gideon could be on the field, and he wasn't really exploited that much. I don't think he was targeted in coverage, maybe just once, but he played well against the run. I think he ended up getting a stop, and he also squeezed a lane to prevent Ezekiel from going up the middle, and ended up assisting another tackle without touching him. But yeah, it was really just kind of an astounding effort from the defensive ends and the linebackers. And typically you'd say, hey, wouldn't you think that the defensive tackles had great games? And I know that this is one of the mailbag questions we got that, hey, a lot of people expected a drop off with Linval, and hey, I thought, Jaleel Johnson ended up getting a poor PFF grade or a negative PFF grade. Why is that? And they still ended up having a pretty good game against the run and Ezekiel Elliott in particular. And I think a lot of it is that Johnson was playing kind of up and down, which we saw last year when he was on the field in the preseason. And I thought this year he'd be better based off of what he did in training camp, but I wasn't super optimistic. And we saw it again, where on some snaps he'd be kind of just pushed off the ball, and normally that would create some pretty significant running lanes. But we saw linebackers and defensive ends, get down and kind of crush that a little bit and prevent that from becoming a problem. And then other times, he would hold up a double team, maybe even get a tackle or two. But for the most part, he didn't do all that well. And then he also just couldn't produce as a pass rusher, which again is a nose tackle. You don't expect a ton of it, but they should get some pressure on occasion, especially given how long Dak Prescott ended up holding onto the ball on some of these snaps. So really the way to stop Elliott for the Vikings in this game was to see some pretty extraordinary linebacker play and some really great defensive end play, especially from Everson Griffin, who just had, I think, a really phenomenal game. He might have been the best player the Vikings had. And that, I think, would include Dalvin Cook, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, Delvin definitely had just an amazing game throughout. But, there were a couple of things that I wanted to ask you about, because as I was rewatching the game this evening, a couple things really stood out. The first thing is obviously, is the hip dance the source of Dak's power?
Actually, yes.
In an odd way,
right.
In a world.
I don't know if Daniel Jeremiah said it on Twitter or they said it on the broadcast, but I remember them talking about him working on this to open up his hips before he opens up his shoulders, or someone said it. And that's actually true, because you generate a lot of your arm strength throughout the entire kinetic chain. And so, throwing power tends to come from the feet, and that's why they emphasize mechanics, because it gives you power as well as control. And your ability to well, actually, even Cousins even talked about your ability to flip your hip as part of that kinetic chain is a really big part of being able to throw the ball really well. And so what he's doing is he's working out those muscles, which are remarkably difficult to work out outside of a throwing motion. And so that's what he's doing. He's doing the middle third of his throwing motion as he's dancing, but also it looks hilarious. Also I think we saw, it wasn't Russ
Garoppolo.
who did it. Garoppolo did it the next day. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if every quarterback did, or most quarterbacks did, but now they're catching it on camera. And I don't know, Dak looks like he's got maybe a little bit more rhythm to it, but Garoppolo looks more handsome. So I don't know if that's a wash or what.
You're just blinded by the handsomeness of Jimmy Garoppolo.
It's too much, man.
It truly is. Side note, I really am enjoying the memes on Twitter involving the different music that they end up playing. Obviously, Hips Don't Lie is the first thing that they played, but right around the time that you're breaking out Suavemente too, that was gold. That was solid gold. I did need to bring that up. Also, the 57, I'm going to talk about the wide receivers in just a second, but there was a 57-yard field goal miss basically to start the game for the Cowboys. And I didn't understand necessarily why they would be going for it at that moment. I realize that they have a decent kicker and they're indoors, but 57 yards to start a game seems ambitious.
Well, so the problem, there's a couple of things at play here. The first is that these occur in, some people call it, I think, the maroon zone, which makes it sound more Twilight-y than it does red zone. But it's, before you get to the red zone, it's this area where it's really difficult to determine whether or not you want to punt, go for it, or kick the field goal. And 4th and 6 is a difficult ask of a head coach to go for it, especially one as conservative as Jason Garrett. And so, 4th and 6, 57-yard field goal, or kind of a shitty punt. where like if you do it really well, obviously, you'll pin them at the 1 or whatever, but there's a really good chance that you gain like 14 yards of field position. Great. Why punt?
Or if you end up in the situation like they did on Monday night where they end up just trying to get you to jump off sides, and if you don't, oh well, we're going to get the delay of game. We get 5 yards. We get more room to kick. We get more room to kind of pin you down.
Which always seems counterproductive to me. But yeah, those are your choices. And the second thing that comes into play is that Dallas has become, as an organization, I think fans are pretty annoyed with it, pretty enamored with Brett Maher's leg because he's a really inconsistent kicker. He missed a bunch from 40 plus this year, missed a couple last year, but he's just really inconsistent kicker. But he's got just an incredible leg. And so they're really obsessed with this idea of being able to kick long. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if every short miss he has, they feel the need to make up for it with those long kicks and just kind of be aggressive about those decisions to kick it. So yeah, I think that's it. I think that's the reason, is that they're in kind of a weird spot in terms of field position. And also they've got this guy where they love the thing where he does the long kick. So send him out there.
Like, this couldn't possibly backfoe. It did. Or they listened to the show last week and they've heard that the kicks seem to go in more often against the Vikings than they do against other teams. So they're like, hey, let's play the odds.
That's just good scouting. Can't fault them for that.
They're listening to our show for scouting. Clearly that somebody needs to be fired. So we had 2 wide receivers, Randall Cobb and boy, his name is escaping me despite the fact that he was killing us on the field, Amari Cooper. We had 2 wide receivers for over 100 yards, and these circus catches were getting ridiculous. I counted 4.
Right, and a third receiver got 76 yards, Michael Gallup.
Yeah.
And the thing is, Gallup and Cooper, great. Cooper's a great receiver. Gallup's a really good receiver. Randall Cobb, I mean, at that point, it's just kind of embarrassing.
As soon as I didn't even know that he was on the Cowboys for some reason, and the moment I did, I went, oh well, he's going to light us up.
Right, yeah.
Just as part of some like not revenge game, but just I've beaten up on the Vikings for years for no good reason. In defiance of my level of talent, I am going to go in and I am going to have a game.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you only look at those circus catches, I think you could say it's difficult to fault the coverage for some of these, like the crazy toe taps by Amari Cooper. I think there's a great kind of reach and grab by Randall Cobb. The circus catches, you're just like, well, I can't be that angry about them, right? Which is like fine, but there's still like another 300 yards you have to account for after that. So it's not enough to be like, well, you can't blame the coverage for just these undefendable plays, because you can certainly blame the coverage for all these defendable plays that really supplemented those circus catches in a really big way. And it's annoying. When we learned that Trey Waynes was just not going to play, I had a discussion that, maybe there's a silver lining here that we might discover that Mike Hughes is the best cornerback on the roster. And I think for most of the year, in limited snaps, he's played like it. I thought in the preseason, there were indications that he was going to be ready to go. Obviously he wasn't, but there was, in training camp, we were able to see him kind of work out, and he's already more fluid while recovering from injury than either Trey Waynes or Xavier Rhodes. And last year, he played really well before the injury. So, there's a lot of reasons to believe that Mike Hughes, especially because the type of praise that Zimmer would lavish on this rookie was not really like the kind of things that he'd said about defensive backs previously. So there's a lot of reason to believe that he would be cornerback 1 or the best cornerback on the roster. And so to see this game from him where, you can kind of give him some slack for what happened with a couple of those Cooper catches, one of them for a touchdown. But, a lot of them, it's really difficult to give him the same latitude I've actually been giving Rhodes. And in fact, in this game, Rhodes ended up giving up 60-odd yards, which is not great. But 2 of them I'm not like super concerned about. One of them was an Ezekiel Elliott one that occurred not like in the flat where it was kind of Rhodes' coverage responsibility, but, the coverage was rolling and he had to stay on top. And so, it's more an issue of a missed tackle with him on that one. And then the Blake Jarwin one was like 7 seconds into the play. So those don't bother me as much. But the Mike Hughes ones where you're not looking at those circus catches, I thought he made kind of a lot of coverage mistakes and he was kind of out of position. And I know he's trying to stay on top of the speed threat that Amari Cooper represents. But you have to be able to cover the comeback route too. Otherwise, they're just going to nickel and dime you for an entire drive. And chunks of 12 yards are not insignificant. So, I thought he made a lot of mistakes, and it was unfortunate to see because the sooner he plays really well, if indeed he's going to play well, the easier it is to resolve this kind of upcoming question about what to do with Trey Wayne's contract and what to do with Xavier Rhodes' contract. So obviously Wayne's is going to be heading into free agency along with Mackenzie Alexander. There are going to be questions about how to handle that with the cap pressure that the Vikings have, but also if Rhodes continues to play at an average to above average level. And again, I do think that he's playing a lot better than the statistics indicate. But he's not living up to his contract. He could become a tradable asset. And so it's easier if, Holton Hill never gets suspended and Mike Hughes plays pretty well in, his first kind of big starting role with the Vikings. And, that didn't happen. And so it complicates the picture a little bit. He could play well for the rest of the year and kind of resolve it and clean it up pretty easily. Not a huge concern in terms of kind of his long-term development, but still annoying and frustrating because I don't know that even after the month that Cousins had, plus this week, I guess this week wasn't like astounding or anything like that, but NFC Offensive Player of the Month for October, I don't think we trust the offense to just always make up for defensive failures. Like the Lions game really felt kind of out of character for the Vikings. And I don't know that we can consistently rely on this offense, even though I know analytically speaking, offensive production is much more consistent from week to week than defensive production. It just seems like this Vikings team is kind of poised to collapse if those quarterbacks don't have the ability to cover. And the thing is, even after we talk about all these quarterback struggles, and it seems to be a different one every week. It could be Trey Wayne's one week, Xavier Rhodes another week, I guess Mike Hughes this week. They're still like 7th or 8th in opponents adjusted net yards per attempt. So, that's pretty good, but it feels off.
It does, especially when you just watch them consistently. Well, actually, I feel like in this game specifically, it was a situation of we were focusing on stopping the run, but then we couldn't get anything in the way of pressure on Dak Prescott. I didn't count it was either 1 sack or 0 sacks, and I know one of them got called back because of a penalty. But when we were able to break the line and harass him, he was not terribly effective. There were a couple of forced throws, a couple of drops that would have been better, or that would have been caught if it would have been slightly more developed. But we couldn't get to Dak Prescott.
Well, so this is the thing where I think if we look at it from the perspective of we're worried that Dak Prescott's about to make a play, I think it feels like we can't get to him. But if you just laser focus on watching Everson Griffin or Danielle Hunter, it actually feels like the opposite. And I found this interesting because I got a mailbag question in The Athletic that basically said the same thing. Hey, it really felt like we didn't get a ton of pressure on Dak Prescott. And the thing is, I felt like we did get a ton of pressure on Dak Prescott. Why do I feel this way, and why do other people not feel this way? And I think it's because it didn't really look a lot like pressure. Plus, when you only have 1 sack in a game, it really doesn't validate the idea that there's been a ton of pressure in the game. So I took a look at the PFF statistics, and he was under pressure for 47% of his dropbacks. That's an incredible amount of pressure. He just performed really well in a lot of those circumstances. And I think when there was a throw that was kind of off target, or when there's a positive result for the defense, like the Holton Hill pass deflection, you can take a look and see Everson Griffin got pressure, but a lot of people were focusing on Holton Hill, right? When there was a throw that was off target, then you can go back and say, hey, there was a little bit of pressure there. But I think that when there was pressure, but a positive play occurred for the Cowboys, we didn't really register it as pressure in our head. So he ended up with a 55% completion rate under pressure per PFF, which is not great, but actually not that poor in the context of just being pressure. But he averaged 9 yards an attempt. So obviously the one interception, which was to Jaron Curse on a Hail Mary, that was under pressure. We can just kind of discount that. But he got 3 touchdowns under pressure. And so I don't think it was really the amount of pressure the Vikings were able to put on Prescott. I think is that sometimes the pressure was paired with like an incredible Amari Cooper play, and we're all looking at the play and not realizing that Dak Prescott just got leveled by Danielle Hunter, who ended up with like I think 2 hits in the game, along with Everson Griffin, who got 2 hits in the game. But they did put pressure on him. It just I think it felt invisible because we didn't get to see the fruits of that labor, as it were. So there was pressure on him. He just performed, I think, either really well or really poorly under pressure. And on the throws where he performed really well, it just doesn't feel like pressure arrived at all. If you take a look, if you just watch Everson Griffin and Tyron Smith, you wouldn't think that Tyron Smith was a former All-Pro or a current All-Pro or whatever. You'd think, they just grabbed him off the street. Everson, destroyed him. And the thing is, the broadcast said that there wasn't much pressure. And I think that influences people too. They're like, this feels like only the second time Everson Griffin beat Tyron Smith. And I was thinking that's an insane thing to say. He did a great job. One of the ways that it kind of tricks you is when Prescott moves as a result of pressure, but he looks calm and collected because he's sliding up into the pocket. And so it looks like that's just part of the play. He drops back, he hitches forward, Griffin arcs past, it feels like nothing happened, but he's clearly responding to the pressure he sees and altering his launch angle and his footwork. And that's pressure. And the offensive tackle didn't want that to happen. The defensive end got past the offensive tackle. The defensive end got to the quarterback's landing point, right? But the quarterback moves and it looks just so natural it doesn't feel like pressure. So I think all of that kind of plays a role. But I thought the defensive line, and in particular Hunter and Griffin, actually did a really great job as pass rushers.
So I want to see if there's any sort of a parallel in these two plays, because when I watched it again, I felt like there was a bit of a parallel between the decision. So at one point, Michael Gallup ends up one-on-one with Eric Kendricks closest to him, and ends up making it in for the touchdown. It was a little dump-off pass. It was the first touchdown for the Cowboys of the game. Later in the game, a somewhat similar play, but with one-on-one coverage with Ezekiel Elliott. And the person in the exact right position was Eric Kendricks to make the play to knock it down. I know at the end of the game that they were still looking to get Ezekiel Elliott involved because he's obviously one of the faces of that franchise and had been stalled basically the entire game. But do you feel like that had any the fact that they were able to get one-on-one in a situation that they were successful in earlier, if that had any sort of bearing as to why they ended up throwing it to Zeke there?
Yeah, well, I think that does play a role when you kind of repeat the same plays or the same concepts. Sometimes you just keep doing it because it keeps working, which actually the Vikings against the Saints in the divisional round 2017, the Buffalo Right 7 Heaven, they ran that like 3 times in a row, and it was working. So that happens, but on the other side of that, defenses can anticipate and adjust. The problem is adjustments occur off of anticipated adjustments, and then you just kind of look like an idiot. I think it does play a role that they're using these concepts that they felt that they were successful on. Like you said, they got a touchdown. Plus, like you said, they just kind of want to feature Zeke. That in a critical situation, they went to a play that they were comfortable with because it had already worked in the game, and the defense just happened to adjust that time. And in particular, Eric Kendricks, who basically ended up winning the game with that one.
So how exactly did he end up kind of disguising how close he was, or how did he exactly make that move? Because on the broadcast, or even the pictures that have kind of floated around on Twitter, it looked like they had Zeke dead to rights.
Yeah, it just seems like an incredibly athletic play. It's not even that he's that close. It's that he knows where the ball is going to be before the ball gets out. And so he's moving before, like he's moving in the direction he needs to be moving in. And that gives him kind of a couple of extra steps that kind of makes up for any difference in athleticism he would need to like kind of close that range. But also, I mean, he just makes an incredible leap, which I actually didn't appreciate live. Like I was like, wow, that's a great play. And then, the picture's floating around and I watch it again and it's an astounding play. I just think he just closes really quickly because he knows where he needs to be and he acts with complete confidence because he's already seen this play. So I don't think it's that they disguised anything. I think it's that he had seen this play a couple of times and he knew how it was going to develop.
I did enjoy that of all the people they could have thrown it to or thrown it in the direction of, it wasn't Barr, who has maybe history is the wrong word, but can get burned in that sort of situation. They end up throwing it over to Kendricks, who is playing out of his mind this year. Like, you couldn't have asked for a better Viking defender on that particular moment. Like,
right. Yeah. Like there's like you're harassing Mike Hughes.
You have harassed Mike Hughes all game. And you end up going.
Yeah, he was targeted 17 times that game, which I've never heard of. Like Trey Waynes was the most targeted cornerback in the NFL 2 years ago. I don't think he was ever targeted 17 times in a game. That's astounding. And Xavier Rhodes is not having a phenomenal game. Aside from those 2 receptions I talked about, he allowed 3 receptions on 3 targets, right? Or, like you said, Anthony Barr, who has had his struggles in coverage. I think early on they were able to put a wide receiver on him and they were able to get a completion, right? And so you got Eric Kendricks, who's having like an all-pro season. I think a lot of it is just, they're not really thinking about matchups after the snap occurs. They're only really thinking about matchups when they align the formation and stuff like that. And so I think that's part of it. But man, they couldn't have chosen a better player, huh?
Exactly. Well, let's talk about the offense. And apparently Rudolph is back and better than ever and is also making a ridiculous catch now. Do you feel like that was more of a throwaway, or I meant to do that? Of course. Why it would be silly to ask if I was trying to throw that away unsuccessfully.
No, I think that was on purpose. And the reason I think that is because the way Kirk's body contorts as he's throwing it, if he's throwing it away, there's no reason to go through all that effort. Just, he's already out of the pocket. He's not going to get an intentional grounding. Just throw it out the sideline. Because he has to turn around to do it. So I think that he is attempting to complete a pass to Rudolph. Plus, there's a lot of times where he's attempted to complete a pass to Rudolph in the end zone, and it has gone like 5 feet over his head, and it's not a throwaway. So this is actually consistent with his throws to Rudolph in the end zone.
It could have just been a less crap version of the crap throws he's been throwing to Rudolph in the end zone.
Right, yeah. So, and honestly, fantastic play by Cousins and even more absurdly incredible play by Rudolph. Like, not even like that's one of the best catches I've seen all year. Like it reminds me of his rookie year, like when he's making all these insane one-handed grabs and you're like, oh, wow, he could become something. And then for a while he was, and then he wasn't making those ridiculous catches, and then he was dropping easy ones, and then he was making the easy catches, but not the hard ones. And you're like, well, I guess I can't complain too much about that. Now we're kind of back at he's making crazy catches part. So, I mean, power to him, right? And the thing is, they use kind of a similar route concept on the second touchdown where they've got a fullback in the flat and they've got Rudolph behind him. They are running a couple other routes and they do kind of some trickery with Irv Smith that they detail in the Athletic article, but it's basically the same route for C.J. Hammond. It's the same route for Kyle Rudolph, although now Rudolph is coming from the other side of the formation. So, I mean, I'm pretty confident it was on purpose, but yeah, it's difficult to ask a lot from Cousins in that scenario because, like, he's turning his body all the way around. Fantastic.
Yeah. Let's just talk about Rudolph for just a moment. 2 touchdowns and the 2-point conversion. The 2-point conversion turns into an incredibly important play later in the game. But yeah, that was quite the quite the appearance by Rudolph. He's been relatively quiet this season, except for the last, I think, 4 games, where he's really lit it up. So good on him.
Yeah, he's probably not going to hit the 500-yard seasons that he's been able to hit the past couple of years, but if you can create in the red zone, especially with Adam Thielen out, that's obviously tremendously valuable.
Yeah, he did look happy as hell after that second touchdown to be flashing 2 fingers up in the air, like, nope, that's number 2. I got more in me. I'm gonna be. You see this? I can do this all day. So we can't talk about this Vikings offense without talking about Dalvin Cook. And there's a stat I would like to just throw out there. Actually, 2 stats, really. After this game, Dalvin Cook is still the leading rusher in the NFL. But not only that, he is also still the leader in all-purpose yards for this year. And it's like a pretty good drop-off. It's Dalvin Cook at 1415, Christian McCaffrey at 1,385, and then it drops to 1,100. Like, this is a team that loves Dalvin Cook, and Dalvin Cook is still producing for us.
Yeah, and I think what's really cool is that this is all coming while they've been able to get him involved in the passing game, which obviously speaks to the question of, those yards, the entire yards from scrimmage equation where he's leading the league. But that's really important because the team has emphasized trying to get him involved, and you're always kind of worried about what that might mean if they will intentionally become inefficient on offense by running the ball a lot. And his capabilities as a receiver, I think a lot of people expected it from coming out of Florida State, but his rookie year, he was dropping passes, and then he wasn't all that effective in the passing game. His second year in the league, and then he's been really incredible catching the ball. A lot of it, on screen passes, so you can't say he's like a receiving threat like, David Johnson was before his injuries, or Le'Veon Bell in the same way, but he's getting yards in the air, or I guess Christian McCaffrey. You're not expecting him to run wide receiver routes like you would like Mike Boone or Christian McCaffrey, but you're getting a lot out of him. And he adds another element to offensive strategic design that the Vikings have always wanted to have, just because it's kind of a natural response. You want to get kind of good at the screen game. But yeah, being able to neutralize blitzes with screens, especially because Cook is not all that great of a pass protector, getting those screens into the game plan to kind of tire out and slow down defensive ends and the pass rush in general, and having the ability to kind of produce on that. A lot of these screens. So the first screen, I think, of the game in Dallas, all 5 offensive linemen effectively release into the second level, and I don't think any of them land a block. Like, the only block that ends up occurring is one that occurs while Dalvin is getting tackled, 12 yards downfield, and I think Elflein finally finds somebody to block, and by then it's too late. But I think nobody blocked anybody on that screen. He was still able to generate a first down, and so he ends up getting, on the first 3 plays, 68 yards. He ends up, I think, with 86 yards in the air, plus 97 on the ground. And so, yeah, I mean, he gained as many yards as, I guess, Mike Hughes gave up, huh? But was it 153? I just, but yeah, it just really incredible. In the piece that I wrote in the takeaways, I'm kind of just musing about, what does this mean in the context of the discussion about whether or not running backs matter, which really just means the discussion that indicates that running backs are really replaceable, because Dalvin Cook does not look replaceable, even though Alexander Mattison has done a really good job when he's been on the field. And it's kind of difficult to kind of navigate all of this and figure out why you're watching him like break tackles. He had 8 forced missed tackles in the game. He had over 100 yards after the catch, obviously a lot of that coming from behind the line of scrimmage. And so, he only ends up with 86 officially. But yeah, just like really an incredible game from him, and part of the astounding year that he's been having. And this is all while, Cousins goes on this 4-game streak where he's, got the best passer rating over the course of a single month period, the second best passer rating in history, to Peyton Manning, right? And so they're able to throw the ball a lot, and they're still able to involve Dalvin Cook in a way that effectively moves the receiving offense forward. And that's really important because there's a lot of research that says when you get your running backs involved in the passing game, even, deliberately, it's bad. They're the worst targets to have. Tight ends are worth more, and then slot receivers, and then outside receivers. And obviously, a lot of that research, it's difficult to kind of disentangle the fact that running backs are often checkdowns or the third read or something like that. And so naturally, what's happening is that these receivers aren't producing or these receivers aren't being penalized because the quarterback is moving away from them because they're covered, and so you go down to the shorter routes. But in defiance of the fact that targeting running backs tends to be bad in terms of producing like expected points and stuff like that, he's been able to generate a ton of yards in the air. So yeah, he's been pretty valuable in terms of his production. The next question is really, is he replaceable? Because that contract is coming up soon, and I would not be surprised if Dalvin Cook held out. So big question coming up for the Vikings.
His elusiveness is what ends up making him so useful. Just watching the game, if somebody was even remotely near him, the only way you were going to stop him is if you ended up getting his legs. Like, you had to go low on him in order to get him to stop. Otherwise, there was just no chance of getting him. He was just going to blow by you. It was just really fun to watch. So Kirk Cousins won at night. Kirk Cousins won at night on the road. Kirk Cousins won at night on the road against a team with a winning record. So now all he needs to do is like win 8 or 10 more of these, and then like the narrative can be rewritten, right?
Right. Yeah. It's fun because when these happen, you're like, the narrative's broken, and then like 3 weeks later, you're like, well, the aggregate record is still pretty bad. So is the narrative really broken?
Is this one of those situations where the evidence of absence is not the absence of evidence? Like,
it's not quite. It's just, you
go to war with the army you have, not the army you want. I'm just gonna start.
It's closer to that, yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of it is just was it multiple anecdotes is not the singular of data or something like that. Data is not the plural of anecdote. That's it.
Yes.
And you get the one instance and you're like, well, that smashes that into smithereens. And then you think, well, if it is true that he suffers in prime time against winning teams on the road, a very spectacularly specific split, then you'd expect him to win like one of those games. And so if he's like 1-32, that's still pretty bad, or whatever the record is, right? So yes, but also maybe not. I also like kind of don't care about it. Like, it's difficult to beat good teams. Shocker. It's difficult to win on the road. Yep. Combine those. Oh, wow. So that doesn't really bother me. He actually said something about it after the game where he was like, honestly, I think that in some of these games, I play well, or we play well as a team, and we still lose. Like if Maher makes the kick, or if Jaron Kearse doesn't come down with it, and someone else comes down with it, nothing else about the performance for the rest of the game changes. But suddenly, I can't win on the road against primetime teamers. I mean, there's multiple games like that, and I agree. I think that this idea that we're evaluating his ability to perform in those situations based off of the record of the team that he's on, I think is pretty absurd. And, he's performed well in some of these instances. I talk a lot about some of the narratives I do believe about Cousins, like his performance in situational football drills and stuff like that I think are, kind of endemic to who he is as a football player. But like, I honestly don't think this like thing about primetime games is a thing. You just happen to play good teams in primetime.
Yeah, the only reason why this stat why anyone should ever pay attention to this stat is how bad Matt Stafford is against teams with a winning record. Like, that's the only time this stat really matters. It doesn't matter with our own quarterback. It's far more.
It only matters with Matt Stafford.
Exactly. This stat means nothing to every other quarterback in the league, with the possible exception of like, I don't know, Blake Bortles or something. Nobody else it matters. It should matter about. But Cousins had an efficient game. I think that's the best way to put it. Ended up completing 71.88% of his passes and had the exact same number of yards as his game in Kansas City, 2 touchdowns instead of the 3. But the important thing to note here is that he's not throwing picks. He's not fumbling the ball. He is remaining about, as I say, mistake free, but he's not going out and giving the Vikings like a way to lose the game. He seems to be effectively managing things and being able to hit his targets and being able to hand off the ball to Cook, albeit with one heart attack, successfully.
Yeah.
God, that play.
It's
that is
Holy.
classic Vikings. Any other Vikings team, that ball goes to the ground. Adrian Peterson's watching the TV screaming, "How does he get lucky and I don't?"
Yeah, right. It's like, well, he caught it off the deflection.
His hands aren't nearly as strong as mine. Why does ball hit ground? Where's my camel?
Yeah, but also, like, why are you pitching in that situation? Anyway,
ignoring that.
But it always kind of sucks when we talk about, situations where the quarterback plays effective risk-averse football, because we talk about game managing and then we have to say, well, in this instance, we're not saying game manager as an insult or anything like that. And this obviously had happened a ton with Teddy, who played a more conservative style of football than a lot of quarterbacks. And then Sam Bradford, who even more so, right? But in this case, it's not really a problem, because when the Vikings ask Cousins to throw it deep a lot, he's shown the capability to do that. And he's had a bunch of games where he's been able to generate, a lot of yards on a passing plan that requires him to pass. On average, the depth of target is over 10, right? Which is pretty far downfield as an average. In this game, his average depth of target, I think, was like 6.1, which is really low. Over the course of a full season, it would rank like dead last among all quarterbacks. It's not the lowest that he's had this season. He's had like 5.5 and 5.8 in 2 other games, but he's also had some games like closer to 12 and closer to 10. And so he's had games where he's been able to pass really deep and the Vikings win. And he's had games where he's forced to pass deep and the Vikings lose. And he's had games where he passes short and the Vikings lose. And in this game, he passes short and the Vikings win. And I think a lot of it is just I don't think many people would call him a versatile quarterback, but I think the difference between what we call a game manager and what Cousins has the ability to execute is that game managers very often only have the capability to execute one kind of game, which is a risk-averse game that does avoid interceptions like Cousins did in this game and generates like consistent short yardage gains. And so with occasionally, your playmakers kind of just breaking one off and making a big play. And Cousins has the capability, and this is a pretty significant distinction between like some other guys that can throw deep, like, good Cam Newton or Jameis Winston or whatever. He has the capability of operating within whatever the game plan kind of requires for that week. So if it's a week where they have to throw it intermediate a bunch, attack the middle of the field, or attack, the intermediate outs on corner routes or something like that, he has the ability to do that. If it's a game plan that requires him to throw screens, like in this game, he has to throw short, he has to throw slants, for whatever reason, he has the capability of executing that at a pretty high level. If it's a game plan where he has to throw deep a bunch, he has the capability of executing that. And so this is one example where he has the ability to execute that, what's required of him. And so in this game, a lot of the burden of the passing game is put on the receivers to generate after the catch, to make sure that they get open with enough space, to make sure that they can generate after the catch, to make sure that, the passing window is open really quickly because they're getting rid of the ball quickly. And so on, and a lot less of it is put onto Cousins, who has to read the defense, get rid of the ball quickly, instead of kind of waiting for the play to develop, navigating kind of maybe more difficult defenses or Marty Pocket or whatever, and trying to thread a needle deep downfield. And so Cousins did not have a magnificent game. He also didn't have a ton of opportunity. And he did miss throws deep. Let's not forget that, but he didn't have a ton of opportunity to have a magnificent game. And so you can't really fault him for that, but you can say, hey, there's ways for the Vikings to win on offense without Cousins bearing kind of all the burden. And this game is kind of one example of that. And so he ended up generating a ton of his yards after the catch. So he had very few, a small proportion of his yards in the air. Cook obviously had 100+ yards after the catch. But then you've got, I think BC Johnson had a couple of yards after the catch, and then you had Diggs with a pair of good catches where he was able to generate after the catch, and so a lot of his passing yards end up coming on the ground, as it were. That's fine, however the team produces. It's not an indictment of Cousins, but it is an example that you can execute a bunch of different game plans. Sometimes riskier game plans, sometimes more conservative game plans, and he has the ability to kind of adapt to it based off of, whether or not the defense is kind of allowing that to happen, and he tends not to throw tight windows very often. Also, we did see one tight window throw to Diggs that could have been a touchdown in this game, but he generally doesn't tend to throw tight windows often, so that is a limitation. But other than that, he can execute a variety of game plans, and so this is a really good example of him, being able to do that in a situation where the Vikings, maybe they needed him to take a couple more risks because it did end up getting pretty close. It was a one-score game, but for the most part, didn't ask too much of him. And so he was able to kind of deliver within those confines and not go kind of off script.
Diggs did have a very impressive little circus catch of his own, albeit it wasn't out of bounds, but he was able to keep it under control. And I just liked the look and what he had said to the ref immediately after, like, no, you'll see. You'll see on the replay. just put this ball right down here. We'll be picking this up in just a moment.
Yeah, right. It was what a catch. And I do find it weird that the ref marked it incomplete. I know that the ball in terms of the sideline ref's vision, Diggs is kind of covering up the ball. He can't necessarily see it, but I don't know why you would presume that it hit the ground. That was weird.
My thing was, it looked like they were giving after the third circus catch that they were giving Amari Cooper just the benefit of the doubt on them, and Diggs was like, no. Challenge, you have to go and replay that.
Right. I'm not going to say lucky, but it's good that this was an automatic booth review. It was a final 2-minute situation and not one where Mike Zimmer has to waste a challenge, which obviously you get that challenge back when you're successful, but I don't want to use a challenge. That's fine. Great. That happened then. And also that was weird because I wouldn't have necessarily called that a good throw. But Diggs was prepared to go back for it. So maybe, Cousins and Diggs have the kind of chemistry where if that's the specific type of leverage that the receiver has on the cornerback, Cousins can kind of choose whether or not he's going to try and throw ahead and let Diggs catch up or throw behind and let Diggs come back to it. And Diggs was totally comfortable with either one. So maybe it was actually a really good throw. But honestly, it was just a really astounding catch.
Yeah, definitely one of those moments that you can remember as, oh yeah, Diggs in his hands. There was a time that he was fantastic and would just catch anything that was thrown in his direction.
Yeah, this is that guy.
This is that guy. Also, it appears that Chris Collinsworth has fallen in love with CJ Ham. Just the entire broadcast, he had nothing but good things to say about CJ Ham. It almost felt like he had cursed Mike Hughes early in the show by talking about how good Mike Hughes is, and he's the guy to look out, and he gets targeted 17 times.
Right, yeah. Ham, here's the thing. He had 2 really tremendous blocks in the running game that I think, one of them got the Vikings to the 1-yard line or something. He had some pretty tremendous moments. He was missed a couple blocks. And so you take a look at and I think I saw a couple of these go around Twitter where you've got these videos up and they're like, hey, take a look at how incredible CJ Ham is on this block. And yeah, you're right. You've diagnosed that correctly. He's really incredible on this block. But I think there's this idea that he's better than he is because of it. But he misses a good chunk of blocks too. So
Ham has a cult of personality around him. It's hard for this team to win without Ham being effective.
I feel like
much like
you're
Thanksgiving at your house, it's hard for
as a member of the ham cult.
The ham of personality. It makes sense. That's
he's fine.
Terrible. All right. Is there anything else that we should cover before we finish up?
No, that's pretty good. Oh, I do want to add, actually, I'm not going to say the Vikings should have lost that game, but man, were they lucky that the coaching staff for Dallas is incompetent. Like,
God bless
a competent coaching staff, and I don't know that the Vikings get away with that one. Like, they told Tavon Austin not to return. He had like 15 yards of clearance. Like, I understand, like, hey, if nothing else, probably if it's close, just fair catch it. But, like, don't return it. It's just a terrible. Good Lord. They really screwed that up, man.
That was an impressively bad coaching decision. Thank you, Jason Garrett. We appreciated it. Much like all of your terrible coaching decisions. I will say that I was texting my brother throughout the game, and he and I both mentioned that this is the sort of game that Romo would have thrown a game-ending interception for, and we were just pining for the days of Romo and not the days of Dak Prescott actually being efficient. Because there was a buddy of ours who is a big Cowboys fan, and every time that the Cowboys would end up for the 3:30 game, and there would be a terrible interception thrown by Romo, both he and I would just text that guy just full bold faced letters, just Romo, just every single time. I was pining for the days of Romo there. I just wanted it so badly, and then the game ends with a Dak Prescott interception. Like, I like throwbacks. I like nostalgia.
This is comfortable.
Yeah, nostalgia sometimes is a good thing in football, and I'm enjoying this almost as much as I enjoyed that video going around of like the 1970s CBS intro for Welcome to the NFL or the NFL program.
Oh, yes.
And all but one of the highlights is a penalty now.
Yeah.
It's amazing. All right. Let's get into the mailbag. The first question is from our guest last episode, Edward Egros, who asks, why me?
And welcome to the show.
Henry asks, I feel like the narrative is that the Vikings committed to stopping Zeke and therefore gave up more in the air, but this doesn't really match what I saw. To me, it was the corners getting beat underneath or outside. Was this a scheme issue, personnel issue, or something else?
I can't tell if it's a scheme issue or personnel issue. I am inclined to agree, though, that I don't think the focus on stopping the run ended up with a ton of yards through the air as a result. I think that the ton of yards through the air was a product of cornerback play. But whether that's a product of scheme or whether that's a product of personnel, difficult to say because Zimmer's been pretty adamant that it's the scheme. And, obviously he would know. And also he doesn't tend to pull back from criticizing players. But at the same time, the stuff he's asking them to do from, my idiot eyes feels like the quarterback should be giving up a lot less even within the constraints of that scheme. So even though you're capping these routes, preventing them from going deep and always staying on top, we see this a lot, especially with cover 3 teams and especially with Seattle style cover 3 teams where the instruction is to not let anyone get on top of you. And you still saw some pretty remarkable performances over the years from cornerbacks in those schemes. And so I don't think it's just because, they're asking them to stay on top. Like, yeah, sure. If they decided to play kind of a more traditional cover 2 system where they've got the safety on top and they can kind of roll up those corners and press them with a little bit more confidence and play man coverage, maybe that would look a lot different and they would play a lot better, but you'd kind of give up, some opportunities in the run game because you got 2 high safeties, or you'd give up the seam because that's kind of a traditional way to attack cover 2 or whatever. I can see why it would be the case that the cornerbacks would look worse because you're asking them to do something that necessarily kind of gives up some stuff. But even within the confines of what you're asking them to do, I mean, it feels like they're underperforming.
Next question is going to be from Raul, who asks, we talked about the Vikings' poor luck on field goals against. What about penalties? Do opposing teams get called for less penalties or less penalty yards, specifically Dallas Cowboy OPIs?
I'm not that upset about the Amari Cooper OPI, and maybe because I didn't get to see. I don't know. I saw the replay and I just didn't like. It wasn't like crazy obvious to me. I don't know. What's your take on the Amari Cooper?
It was a shove, but it wasn't the most blatant shove of the entire game. I could probably pick three other, not Amari Cooper catches, but at least three other catches that were kind of questionable. But that one that didn't stand out to me.
Okay, yeah. So I'm not crazy. Yeah. So are other teams called less often? There's not really like a study on borderline calls, really, right? Like there's studies on when calls go to replay and how the replay tends to favor the home team in terms of its decision. And you could say that's a proxy for borderline calls, but I haven't seen that breaking down by team. Some people say that, home field advantage is a little bit of product of referee bias, but it's really difficult to prove because if you genuinely play better at home and worse on the road, then you're going to commit more penalties because you're the worst team. And so it's very difficult to disentangle. Specific penalties like, hey, do the Packers get called less for OPI, or do the Cowboys get called less for OPI? I don't know. Maybe they just commit less OPI. Like, so that it's like really difficult for me to parse this out.
I feel like if there was some form of a study on that, it would really be more of just kind of delving down the rabbit hole of NFL fan conspiracy theories, and nobody's going to end up winning if you go down that route. Like,
yeah, it's much better to like preserve the mystery and just be like, yeah, the refs love Lambeau.
Yeah, just absolutely. Nope. Yep. That GIF going around of Rodgers throwing his own flag. Yep, fantastic. That is exactly what ends up happening. Shout out to that, by the way. That was fantastic.
Incredible.
Really did enjoy that. Kenneth Allen asks, and this was during the game, obviously. 2 questions. Is Cooper the best wide receiver in the league? Second question. Is Hughes the worst cornerback in the league? Both are valid questions while that game is going on.
Right, yeah. How demoralizing. Yeah. So no, he's not the best receiver in the league. I think, you've got DeAndre Hopkins, you've got Julio, you've got Mike Evans, you might even have Chris Godwin, honestly. Tyreek Hill's sort of in that conversation. You've got Michael Thomas. No, but he's really good. So you can't always get upset when like a really good receiver eats like young cornerback's lunch. Like, okay, fine.
I think after the third circus catch, you're kind of like, okay, we can discuss this. Koi Boy asks, what do you think was the collective number of years shaved off Minnesotan lives when Dalvin bobbled the pitch on our last drive?
Collective?
Boy.
Yeah, I don't know how many people were watching. Let's go with 30,000.
I think that I know I lost a couple of minutes there. I feel like that was the equivalent of a cigarette. And a cigarette is supposed to, I believe the stat they told us in health was every cigarette is supposed to take either 7 or 11 minutes off your life. So I'm going to go with that. I feel like, well, I know I desperately wanted a cigarette after that bobble, but yeah, let's go with that. It's about the equivalent of a cigarette, so probably about 30,000 for the number of Minnesotans that were watching. Luke Braun asks, have the Vikings been better in 3rd and long than average these last few weeks? It feels like they have found a way to convert a few 3rd down and 10 or 10 plus in critical moments, which is off-brand to say the least.
Yeah, actually. I don't know how much of that is like they got to play like Washington, right? But yeah, so I looked this up before the show. I actually got the numbers kind of confused for a little bit, but the end of it is that weeks 1 to 6, the Vikings 3rd down conversion percentage on 3rd and long, which I define as 7 to 12 yards, because after that, teams aren't really trying to convert on 3rd down. 26.9% first down rate. In weeks 7 to 10, a 36.4% third down rate, which is a 10% bump, which is pretty significant over the course of a year, not super significant over the course of like a couple weeks. And so I'm like kind of curious how this was noticeable, except I also found that the Vikings were in as many third and long situations over the last 4 weeks as they were the first 6 weeks. And so just it happened more often. And they also happened to be converting them at a slightly better clip. So yes, it's probably variance. I don't think there's any particular thing to point to because like half of the first sample includes that incredible October stretch. And this sample includes like games against Washington, right? So I don't know what to make of it, but it's true.
It's a thing. We will run with it. Next question is from Chris, who asks, what is the average number of forced missed tackles for a running back, and how do Cook and Madison compare to that? Madison, by the way, had a fantastic little game and almost found the end zone twice. And I did enjoy on the first attempt that he nearly made it in, just watching every single lineman just run up and try to push him in. Even after the whistle was blown, like, we want you to get this touchdown.
Yeah, pretty fun to watch. And again, with Madison, you're kind of forced to ask the question like, okay, do running backs matter? How replaceable is Dalvin Cook? Because hey, Madison's not doing so poorly, huh? As for the question of like how many missed tackles, so if you take a look at like attempts per missed tackle or missed tackles per attempt, I don't know kind of which one feels better. It's probably missed tackles per attempt. The league average tends to be lower than 1 in 5, lower than 20%. And you typically don't get running backs getting a lot of carries when they don't have the ability to force that many missed tackles. So you end up with a sample that biases towards running backs that tend to get a ton of missed tackles. So quick math, if I'm taking a look at just the running backs that have had a bunch of rushes this year, let's see, 639. Oops. I don't know how a calculator works. Yeah, it looks like it's about 18%. So Dalvin Cook's missed tackle rate on rushes is about the same, but on receptions is higher than any other back in the league. And he's got 16 forced missed tackles on receptions for like 40 receptions, which obviously that's pretty insane. I think for running backs, you get it tends to be a little bit higher, something around 23% on receptions, and Dalvin Cook is at 40%. So that's kind of where most of those missed tackles are coming from. He is among the league leaders in yards after contact per attempt. He's like 5th or something. So he's also just kind of powering through tackles that are not technically missed tackles, but he is generating more yards after contact. So it's like there's a little bit of both. So he's a little bit above league average on missed tackles per rush, way above league average on missed tackles per reception, and he tends to generate a bunch of yards after contact with or without missed tackles.
All right. Also from Chris, he asks, as the Bears are more and more out of the picture, how likely is it that they start Daniel again when they meet the Vikings at home?
That's a really interesting question. They're like very bought into Mitch Trubisky, which is just like stunning to me. But this was like week 16, week 17, I think.
Yeah, week 17.
Yeah, let's say it's 65%. Let's say it's more likely than that.
I was in a Twitter argument. I was channeling my inner Arif the other day when people were speculating that Cam Newton is going to be out of Carolina and where he's going to end up playing, and people were like, "Oh, Chicago," and I'm sitting there going, "Chicago isn't going to get another like first round pick until like 2021, right? Like, what you would end up having to give up for people for Chicago would be like personnel at that point to be like, oh well, I mean, they may consider doing Khalil Mack for Cam Newton just straight up, like
Be fascinating.
like who on the defense would you have to give up if you're Chicago in order to get Cam Newton? Because you're not getting draft picks. Like maybe you get a second and a fourth, but that's Carolina's looking to get a good bounty for him.
Well, so that brings up like an interesting question. Is the best edge rusher in the league, and let's assume that Khalil Mack is he worth an average quarterback? My intuition says yes, but I think a lot of people would say no, right? And Cam Newton, like obviously he's had MVP years, obviously he's had these really poor years, driven I think mostly by injury. But on balance, you'd say going forward, if he's fully healthy, he's an above average quarterback. But let's dial that back and say he's an average quarterback. I say absolutely 100% an average quarterback is worth, especially for Chicago. An average quarterback is worth more than the top edge rusher, but I think a lot of people just would not agree to that.
That'd be one hell of an interesting tweet from Schefter. I am just envisioning Chicago trades Khalil Mack for Cam Newton and just watching the chaos ensue. Like, oh no, Arif, now Chicago has a quarterback who can throw left and run left too. Oh no.
No. To cover the whole field again. Ridiculous.
Too bad. Beef Brewski asks, I'd love to hear you talk about the wisdom of focusing on shutting down the run. The analytics folks would say focus on the pass, no, since that's the more bang for your buck play. Or is Zeke so good it's a different story?
I'm kind of curious as to like what it means to focus on the run defensively. Whether that means you play tighter in the box or whatever, because again, a lot of the defense is responsive. So you put Ben Gedeon on the field because their personnel put an extra tight end or even more likely an extra fullback onto the field, right? You match up like receiver to cornerback, and so you've got nickel when they've got three receivers out there and so forth. You tend to put more players in the box when the offense has more players in the box, which is why when Adrian Peterson was running against 8-man boxes, I was like not that enamored with the statistic, because after taking a look at how many players the Vikings were putting in the box, it was actually not that different from league average. And so teams don't tend to tighten up that much, like against when they're like quote unquote focusing on the run. Obviously on 3rd and long and 2nd and long, there's fewer players in the box than there are, when the offense is putting them in. And so situationally they're focusing quote unquote on the pass. But I don't know that there's actually a ton of evidence that, aside from biting on play action, that teams do anything on a particular play that makes them kind of focus on the run more, because they just tend to read their keys. They see, is the guard run blocking or not? I'll take a step forward if they are, I'll take a step backward if they aren't, and kind of begin the play. And so I don't know. I would argue that the best kind of case scenario in terms of studying that we have is the Green Bay game, where and this really only works against teams that run wide zones. So you can't even have a complete study, where an unblocked defender, the backside end man on the line of scrimmage, usually a defensive end, sometimes an outside linebacker, sometimes a safety, is just unblocked. And if they immediately pursue the running back, they're focusing on the run. If they stay at home to rush the passer on play action, then they're focusing on the pass. And that's the only indication that you have. In that case, I don't know that it helped Green Bay a ton, because Dalvin Cook ended up averaging 7 yards or over 7 yards a carry, which is what you get when you have an average quarterback throwing the ball. So it's a 1-game sample. It wasn't that conclusive. I would say analytically, if you've got a choice, focus on the pass. And that to me is more a roster construction thing than anything else. Maybe it affects your decisions to call man coverage or zone coverage. You call zone coverage a little bit more often if you want to focus on the run, because you've got your eyes forward. So you've got the ability to go downhill a little bit easier. Plus, quarterbacks don't have the cue to scramble when they see a cornerback's back turned. But if you're like a bad man coverage team, like you're not focusing on the run, you're playing good coverage when you play zone. So I don't know kind of what that would look like, but to the extent that there would be an effect, yeah, I absolutely agree that, teams should much more often focus on preventing the pass. I know when you ask players in the locker room, hey, why do you bite on play action so much? Why don't you just kind of let the play declare itself if it's a run and automatically defend the pass instead of automatically defend the run and then realize it's a pass? And the players will say, well, it's because they get to run all over you. And you're like, well, fine, but that's like 5 yards. The pass is like 13. Like, don't you want to stop the more efficient play? And so in the context of like play action, yeah, but like every team does that. So it's not, again, except for apparently the Packers. And I've seen the Patriots stop biting on play action a lot too, which maybe that'll tell you something. But yeah, I don't like, yeah, I agree, but I just don't know what it looks like in a world where I kind of agree.
Iowa Josh asks, I don't think I like this new defense where we don't cover 10 to 20 yards right down the middle of the field. Are the coverage calls a lot different than last year or a few years ago?
Well, they're a lot different from a few years ago. But it's just been kind of a natural evolution of the defense. I mean, they've played, when they started out, they played a bunch of cover 2 and cover 3. Now they're playing a lot of cover 4. But the defense has just kind of evolved in that direction. I don't think it's this year they've suddenly done this. That's just a coverage shell. How they play the coverage shell, it seems like has changed really significantly over the past year. So yeah, they seem to be playing, I'm not going to say off coverage a ton because that doesn't seem to be in the plans. And when cornerbacks play off coverage in inopportune situations, they seem to get benched. But they are playing with a particular respect for the deep ball that they haven't in the past and attempting to prevent explosive plays. And in doing so, seem to give up these coverages underneath. But they've done that kind of coverage before, maybe not to the crazy extent that they're doing it now. And by crazy, I just mean like an absurd amount, not like, I can't believe you're doing that. Although I do disagree with kind of the decision making there. But in the past, when they've done it, they haven't gotten like destroyed underneath. So it's not a conscious decision to allow 5 to 7 yard passes. It's more a conscious decision to deprioritize covering those passes, which doesn't mean not covering those passes. And in the past, they've been able to break those up. So, yeah, the coverage calls are different in some ways, but I don't think that they're so different that it's defining the issues the cornerbacks seem to be having this year.
Let's go to Eddie, who doesn't necessarily ask a question, but he more throws down the gauntlet to Arif. And I really think since I was convinced to take Eddie's bet with he and I in fantasy, I really think you should give this a consideration. Arif, I will double down. In addition to the prior parameters, which means that you get to choose whatever image for his avatar on Twitter for, I believe, the rest of the football season, I will also get a year's sub to The Athletic if Arif beats me this week. If I win, Arif must also introduce himself as, quote, inferior to Eddie in fantasy on the football machine in hours 1 and 2. Is Arif a communist and a coward?
No comment on the first thing. The second thing is that that's just cheap. It's clickbaity. I will not accede to. The reason you had to agree to it, James, is because you've had a feud with Eddie. I have no feud with Eddie.
I have no feud with Eddie at all.
And also, commissioner of the league, you've got a lot more at stake. I don't see, but I would have
but Arif, all the lights in this house seem to be like getting quiet, getting like darker. Like, I don't understand. You said they're okay though, right? Don't gaslight me, you son of a... No! You have been the one. You've been the one with the feud with Eddie. Eddie, I was merely...
Yeah, I'll agree to the bet.
Okay.
I do hope this is the league that I've got the good team, because one of the leagues my team is just a garbage fire. It's like 2 or 3 wins, and the other league I got like 6 or 7. So
yeah, well, let's at least you don't have to. Yeah, at least you don't have to do 2 minutes straight of blowing smoke up the guy's ass. Don from Ohio asks an interesting question. Which team is better, 2017 Vikings or 2019 Vikings?
Geez, that's a really good question.
I feel like the offense is better put together for 2019, but 2017 was no slouch either.
It was the top defense in the league, and only the Jaguars were close. And I think in the final analysis, I would have given it to the Vikings over the Jaguars. So it was the top defense in the league in 2017. 2019, it's, 10, 11, 9, 8? Somewhere around there. But obviously the 2017 Vikings are, they finished 13-3. They'll finish likely with a worse record this year. Although I guess they've only got 3 losses this year, right? So it's possible. But the 2017 Vikings were so luck driven to me, which we've talked a lot about with Keenum.
Yep. And
so it's very difficult for me to say, hey, if they played each other under the same rules, that the 2017 Vikings would win. I think it's probably the 2019 Vikings, but man, those 2017 Vikings felt magical, and that was even before the Minneapolis Miracle, right?
Yeah, so the 2017 Vikings, to me, when I think about the 2017 Vikings, I think of the fact that no matter what Case Keenum threw in the direction of Adam Thielen, he caught. It could be like 10 feet over his head, and he still found a way to catch it. It could have been, circus catch. He's got it. Diggs too. So it's
and we can even incorporate the fact that Diggs and Thielen were both better that year than this year, and we can say, hey, it's not that Kirk is better than Keenum. It's that 2017 Thielen is better than 2019 Thielen. 2017 Diggs is better than 2019 Diggs. I think even after you include all of that, I might still give it to the 2019 Vikings because the number of dropped interceptions, especially in the actual game Keenum had against Cousins, I don't see that coming back, right? And that's the reason I was so skeptical right before the playoffs, that I just didn't think this team kind of had the juice to do it. And I think, for most of that New Orleans game, I think a lot of us were just like, man, Keenum really just doesn't have it. It's rough. The offense can't score. The defense is kind of getting walked over. The Vikings were losing, and obviously for most of the game they were, until kind of the final moments. And so I think for most of that game, it felt like the Vikings weren't, kind of fit to be in that game. And then obviously the Eagles game, there was one good drive, and then everything else was, actually, I can't remember it, so who knows what happened. But
you just black out that. But the Saints game, the Vikings were ahead until halftime. And for all of the third quarter and most of the fourth, that was the Saints coming back and whipping it into a frenzy. So.
But yeah, I just feel like it was very easy to say, hey, I don't believe in this magical Vikings team because magic isn't real. This team, it just feels like, well, I know what they're good at and I know what they're bad at. And when they do the things that they're good at and when their opponent can't take them away, they win. And it's true. And when they do the things that they're bad at or the opponent forces them into those bad things, they lose. Like, there's not a ton of variance in their production. It just seems like, I think there's a ton of variance, right? In terms of like game to game, you've got this Super Bowl quality team one week, and then you've got this like disastrously awful team the next week. A lot of variance game to game, but in terms of kind of evaluating the constituent parts, it's just like, it's almost like you can plug it into a formula, right? Like, I wish I could, because then I'd be much better at predicting whether or not the Vikings win. But it really feels like they are ultimately playing to their level of quality in each individual game when you take a look at all of the individual elements that compose that game. Like, Cousins isn't benefiting from a bunch of dropped picks or anything like that. The picks that he's throwing are the picks that he's throwing. Like, yeah, he's had a couple of picks where it was like Diggs' fault, and obviously Diggs is fumbling a lot more this year. But it really feels like, for the most part, the team is playing to the level of play that they are, whereas that 2017 team was just punching above its weight, and by the end, it just couldn't sustain that. So I'll go with the 2019 Vikings, but I'll also say it is totally reasonable to select the 2017 Vikings.
Yeah. Also from Don from Ohio, how much extra Patreon money do we need to donate to have a video made of James and Arif catching a fish in Seattle? I'm on board with this. I'm ready to catch a fish in my hands that's thrown to me at the market. Are you?
Yeah, fine.
Arif, the shutdown corner. That's my concern is that you're going to be better at this because you're a shutdown corner.
Hey, I did actually shut down Luke Inman the second time, on the rooftop when we were doing it. There's video of that, but no one's sharing that. That hasn't gone viral.
Well, no, it doesn't go viral because it doesn't involve you falling on your face. Kyle Slaby asks, I saw Jaleel had a down game per PFF, but the run defense was stellar all night. Was Linval's absence felt worse than the team's stats indicate?
Yeah, I think so. I think, one, the Vikings didn't get interior pressure, which I think that would have altered the likelihood of Griffin and Hunter getting sacks because Prescott's stepping up into the pocket, right? And so if that's not there, if Jaleel Johnson keeps getting bullied out of the ability to kind of influence the pocket, then there's probably sacks waiting for them, and that takes the game further apart. It's more difficult for Dallas to do anything about it. And then second, I think the tackles for like 1 or 2 yards turn into tackles for loss. And so they end up really off schedule. And Dallas is somewhat similar, I think, to the Vikings in that they really want to be on schedule. Obviously, Prescott is playing a lot better this year than Kirk is, and Kirk is playing really well. But for the most part, and Dak has much more capacity to improvise, but for the most part, they're also an offense that wants to be on schedule. And so I think that his absence was felt a lot worse than the team stats could indicate. And they're usually in areas that are difficult to say, hey, he would have gotten a sack here, right? Like, it's difficult to just say there are missing sacks in the data. But I think that's probably what happened and why all of those pressures didn't turn into finishes.
Also from Kyle Slaby, he asks, when Dusty O'Connell sues for full control of Norse Code LLC, what name will you select for the replacement podcast? I'm not doing another podcast if we lose control of Norse Code LLC. Arif and I are just going to go underground with our public assistance board game ring and make our millions that way, the old-fashioned way.
Just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and then teach others to do the same.
Exactly, through the wonder of public assistance. That's such a terrible joke. Also, Kyle ends it with, we are going to have 30 guests over for Thanksgiving, and I need some extra time to plan. How many pounds of protein should I make? I plan on having ham and turkey, but what else should I have? Well, Arif wouldn't want you to have turkey, but clearly the other type of protein you should have is human. I feel like human is versatile. Versatile enough where you can kind of make this work. Plus, you have 30 guests over. Nobody's going to notice if you got 29. Just be one less person to walk across the screen during a big moment of the game. So
yeah, I mean, like, what is that? A 3% loss in personnel? That's barely noticeable.
Exactly. Most businesses would just write that off. You're going to be fine. I'm trying to think of like an additional thing to have, like
in terms of protein.
Yeah, like ham, turkey.
I would substitute the turkey for like goose, but that's kind of difficult to find.
Yeah,
maybe a tough ask.
Plus, I mean, apparently geese are just going crazy, according to the video game memes on the internet. So
yeah, right, yeah. Well, they're an infestation. You got to do something about it.
Canadian, just have some Canada. Wow, just have some Canada goose. Yeah, just that'll be nice and gamey.
Probably like a cheap chuck roast, or even just a stew. Like, just cut up a stew and make that. You can make that the day before. No one minds. Stew tastes better the second day anyway.
Go hard on the like charcuterie like situation. Like, just make sure you have a bunch of like sausage out, like the sausage like meat and cheese trays, with the crackers with them. Just make sure to just overload your guests with that and just like shove that down their throats. That way you have to plan on them having less ham and turkey because they're going to be already full by the time the meal actually hits.
Well, I mean, I can agree with that. I just feel like that's not in the spirit of the question. But no, yeah.
What kind of protein? All of them before the meal itself.
Right.
How many pounds of protein? Doesn't matter at this point. They're all full. Although I believe you're supposed to figure between 1 and 1.5 pounds per guest, but that's for you and Miss Manners to figure out. Arif, what do you have to plug?
So like I've mentioned a couple of times, I've got that piece up at The Athletic that's reviewing the game. The couple of takeaways. I talk about the Dalvin stuff. I talk about the play design that I really liked, and I talk a little bit about Mike Hughes. Coming up, I've got a story in Afadio Denabo. I don't think I'll be previewing the Broncos game on The Athletic, so you'll just have to listen to the podcast for that. Hopefully I can find a guest for it. But yeah, that's all I've got to plug.
All right. Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We hope you enjoyed it. Please check us out later this week when we will be previewing the Broncos game. But for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember that revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we will see you later this week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.